room mix up. I think our AV calendar and our schedules meeting plan got mixed up. So in the future, we'll compare the two, make sure that doesn't happen again. But anyway, thanks for exercising with us today. I had a cookie on the way out there, and I feel like I earned my steps getting back. So hopefully it's good for you all too. But there's, I call my secretary, I bring it down. But I think Jeff, let's see, there's Jeff. Yeah, we want to just start diving into it, and maybe we can give it just a couple minutes for anybody that's lingering on here. Is anybody here with from US MAG today? Oh, there you go. Perfect. So I think we have most of the committee represented. The core lab knows that they'll send people here. So yeah, Jeff, let's get started whenever you're ready. And I'm just going to give these out real quick. I did print off some copies of the protocol that was sent yesterday, so y'all have a physical copy in front of you. And here, I'll let you pass those around.
I want to apologize to everybody. I learned that Wi-Fi is not always my friend because I was plugging in and out of the Wi-Fi and missing emails. And so sorry for the mix-ups.
Get you, Jeff.
All right. Well, while I wait to get my screen up there, I think first thing, let's go through introductions around the table, and then we'll go around the back of the room too. Jennifer, can I have you start?
Yeah, I'm Jennifer Bick. I'm with Forestry Fire and State Lands.
And Jeff Liker with Jacobs.
Thomas Steels with the Branching Cooperative. Kyle Stone, Division of Wildlife Resources. Andrew Ruffin, Utah Geological Survey. Joe Hapsey, Compass Minerals.
Aaliyah Chignicki, Utah Geological Survey.
Ben Stireman, Forestry Fire and State Lands.
Craig Miller, One Resources.
Mark Reynolds, US MAG.
Ryan Rowland, USGS.
Bonnie Baxter, Great Salt Lake Institute, Westminster College. Marissa Weinberg, Forestry Fire and State Lands.
And go to the back, Jim.
Jim Harris, Division of Water Quality.
Laura Vernon, Water Resources. Linda Freitas, Friends of Great Salt Lake.
Ben Holcomb, Division of Water Quality. Chris Dandel, Compass Minerals.
Emma Whitaker, Attorney General's Office.
Phil Graham, Great Salt Lake Branching Cooperative.
Scott Enoch, USGS.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. And then online, I see John left with Wildlife Resources, and I see Krishna Khatri, Water Resources, and Layla Mahdi with Water Resources. And then Rob Dubuque with Friends. That's anybody else online? Anybody hovering? All right. So tap in. So with our agenda today, I think there's really two things that we wanted to cover today. At our last meeting, we had, I guess I had introduced a straw man burn protocol to the group. And we had identified a number of questions that we had, I guess you'd call them homework items for folks to work on. And so what I wanted to do is be able to take about a half hour here at the beginning of the meeting and just give a chance for a number of you submitted information, sent information, and I'll get back to the update first. Sure. But then the second other item that we want to talk about are these draft protocol that you have in front of you. Because what we would really like to be able to do is to, I guess, make sure we identify any concerns with the draft protocol and see if it's something that we can approve as a committee at this point, with the idea that it's going to continue to evolve as we learn more, as we get more information here. And sorry, it's just not
It took a minute, but now it is.
That'll work this time. So are you on by chance, Brian, online?
I am not logged into this meeting, but I can.
I've got your presentation here. I can't show it at the
Oh.
moment,
Oh, yeah.
so I'm having a hard time with it. So,
Sure.
um, What we wanted to start out with was just an update on the lake conditions. Salinity.
I'm asking to join.
Okay.
Oh, you are. Supposedly. Nothing is happening.
Zero things. All right.
Not see me.
You keep popping up.
Well, usually there's a pop-up. And we can add you.
Hey Jeff, what do you think about moving ahead on since we're tight on time, moving ahead on the agenda while we figure that out? Maybe I can just quickly go over that legislative update. Does that work? Okay. I'll just make it a quickie since, just to give Ryan some time to get that done, but, we'll go over some of the main legislation, that happened during 2023, the stuff that we think was the kind of rose at the top as far as, Great Salt Lake issues go. But, there's obviously quite a bit of other legislation that occurred. So, there was the HB 491, which was the Great Salt Lake Commissioner Bill. I think you've probably all become somewhat familiar with that, but there will now be a office of the commissioner that will be housed in DNR. It's a sub-cabinet position, and the commissioner will develop a strategic plan and coordinate with all the agencies and interests aligned with the lake. The commissioner will also annually inform the governor, president of the Senate, speaker of the House about the status of the strategic plan, and state agencies and the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council will work with and advise the commissioner. So I don't know who this commissioner will be, but we hope they get someone really stellar in there that wants to be engaged and glean some information off of all the work that's already occurring here in the lake. We also were tracking HB 513. That is another one that was quite important for our division, as it altered some of the statute that we have. So that one was called Great Salt Lake Amendments. It incentivizes non-depletive methods of mineral extraction by modifying severance tax and royalty requirements for lithium. It's also hones in on water-saving technologies and a reduction of depletions, ensures that values derived from extractions are available to protect the resource, and then it also updated 65A-10-8 for the changing needs of the Great Salt Lake. A lot of that information was done 20 or 30 years ago, and this gets rid of some of those things that have already occurred, like what we consider like industrial complex. Like we think that that's largely there already. There were also several other bills that don't necessarily affect just our division, but the HB 307 was the Utah Waterways. That's very similar to the UCARE, and that one will have some funding that goes ongoing to the Division of Water Resources to still help establish the Utah Waterways and their 13-member board. HB 349 was a water reuse project amendment, and that just gets at water reuse on the Great Salt Lake from some of the districts that could otherwise divert water that they would normally go to the Great Salt Lake back into the system. And then SB 53, which was groundwater use amendments, which provides broader access to water users who desire to beneficially use their water by artificially recharging the groundwater aquifer. And then I guess speaking just for forest fire and state lands, we also had about $2 million in ongoing funding that's related to Great Salt Lake for the next or for the upcoming years. A lot of that will have to do with Phragmites, managing the berm. We did receive an additional position, so there's a lot of work and things happening in that regard as well. We also received extra money for the Hot Topic grants that many of you are familiar with. We more than doubled that fund. So there'll be a lot of good research to come as well. And with that, you may have noticed Melissa sent out the Hot Topic grants this year, and we increased the cap for what projects could qualify for, hoping that maybe some of those projects that weren't financially feasible could now be completed. So that's
What's the maximum?
was it 150,000 we increased it to, Marissa?
I think just 100
Oh.
or 125,000.
Okay, I believe it was 125. We wanted to go a bit higher there. So we did send out the RFP for that last week, and hopefully we get some good proposals. We tried to rush things along in order to give folks more time to submit those proposals, but I will leave it at that. Maybe Jim, you might be interested as well. In the DEQ, they received 232,000 one time and 44,000 ongoing for dust monitors as well. So that was another important one. And then of course LiDAR at 1.8 million for the Great Salt Lake and Bear Lake. So there was quite a bit. Probably talk all day just about legislation and appropriations, but those were some of the main ones. So I'll leave it at that.
Ben, I have a quick question, I hope, about the commissioner position. How will the strategic plan work with the comprehensive management?
That's a great question. I hope that it works really well with the comprehensive management plan. But as you know, we have funding to update the comprehensive management plan, and so they're going to be happening at the same time. We were hesitant to start the CMP under the conditions we were in last year, where we had the water trust, the legislative session right on the horizon. So we wanted to get those two things established and passed before we dove into the CMP.
Okay.
So we're gearing up now. We have a meeting scheduled to get ready to start talking about getting the RFP out for the procurement of that plan.
Okay.
So they'll be happening simultaneously, and we're really hopeful that they take into consideration the old plan and the new plan, and they merge together well and complement each other rather than, any alternatives.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
that's what we know.
Thank you.
Sure.
And we're finally up and running here.
Awesome. I'll put skull in the.
Thanks. No, I completely agree. There's so much that's happening. It's hard to keep track of it all. And then, like you asked, how do they all fit together? I think there's a lot of people talking and a lot of.
Sorry, Jeff.
Nope, that's all right. I just thought I lost my computer. Great. Well, if you can walk us through
All right.
your update.
Okay, so let's do a little update on Great Salt Lake. I'll do the elevations, some of the monitoring of the new breach, and then briefly we'll give a Salinity update. And then as we get into the meeting, we'll talk about the homework assignment. Christine she might be online. She's under the weather, not feeling well. She's there. I see she's there. So Scott Heineck is going to take care of a lot of the Salinity and homework discussion, but Christine might jump in if she's able. Hope she starts feeling well soon. All right. Well, we've all seen this snowpack, hopefully, slide in the last day or two. If you haven't, here it is. There's an epic amount of snow, and we're very excited about that at the Utah Water Science Center. Right now, statewide snowpack, I think, is really close to the 1983 record snowpack. And by the end of this unsettled weather we have, maybe we tie or exceed 1983. We're gearing up for a very big runoff. I oversee the stream gauging program and basic data collection, and chasing floods is something that's in our blood, and it's going to be an exciting year. So Great Salt Lake surface elevation. So this is data for our Saltair gauge on the southern end of the lake. This is the gauge that has the record all the way to 1847. I'm only showing data from October of 2020 to current here. And let's just go to the most recent data from October 2022 onward. We're having a great rise in lake levels on the South Arm. As of March 22nd, so that's yesterday, the average daily value was 4191.0. That's up about 2.5 feet since the record low of 4188.5, if I did my math right. Did I do my math right? Somebody correct me.
That's right.
There you go. I can sometimes do basic arithmetic. So we're up 2.5 feet on the south arm, but of course we have a berm. And so now we have a bigger lake elevation differential relative to the north arm. So here's the same type of plot, October 2020 to current for the saline gauge on the north side of the causeway. This has a record dating back to, I think, 1967, 1963, something like that. And you can see we had a nice rise starting in November, December, through the current, into January, and then things leveled off. And if you were to look at this in detail, we'd see things started leveling off probably about the time the berm was raised to 4192. But we do see increases now in the most recent data. You see a positive slope in the most recent data. So the daily value at that site yesterday was 4189.4, and that's up about 0.9 feet from the low in November. And the low in November at this site was also 4188.5. So we're up about 0.9 feet relative to that. Just quickly, the major surface water inflows. These are cumulative stream flow plots, millions of acre feet on the y-axis. It's a log scale on the y-axis. And we have a water year on the x-axis. The bold black line is the current water year. And then the blue and orange and the green shaded area are max min, and then the so-called normal range, the 25th to 75th percentile. And that light gray line in the middle of the green is the median for the period of record in this site, 65 to 67 years of record. So Bear River near Corinne, we're seeing a nice uptick now. We're coming off of that orange line, and it's a steep slope, and flows, I've been watching those flows, they've increased significantly, and let's just keep it going. That's all I can say. It'll be exciting to watch this and see how this plays out this water year, but we're in the right direction for sure now. Weaver River near Plain City, Utah, exact same type of plot, and the bold black line, also a nice steep increase recently in the slope of that line. We're firmly above the 25th percentile, and we expect good things, especially relative to last year and the year before. We expect better things at this gauge, but we'll see how it plays out. Here's Farmington Bay outflow at the Causeway Bridge. Same plot. Beautiful amounts of water passing that Farmington outflow gauge this water year. We're right near, we're above the 75th percentile. Maybe we're on that blue line, the max measure. This has a shorter period of record. It's a newer gauge. It only has 10 to 18 years of record, depending on, you're looking at daily values, etc. But anyway, really nice flows happening at this gauge. That's much improved, as we all know, relative to last year, especially the year before. It was dreadful, and very, very low flows at this site. Goggin Drain, we're doing well here as well. We're above the 50th percentile, the median, and we're having nice, healthy slope on our bold black line for the current year. So we'll see how things play out as going forward. But certainly, everything seems to be good, improving right now in terms of flows at these sites. Let's talk a little bit about our discharge measurement work at the new breach. I showed basically this exact same slide at our last meeting. The blue circles are, south to north discharge values. The red circles are north to south. And then the elevation difference between the north and south arms are shown with a gray line. And you can see the definitions of the left and right axes there with time along the x axis. The last good discharge measurement we were able to make, manual discharge measurement, was actually on February 2nd. That was prior to the berm being raised to 4192. You see my other vertical line in July, or late July of 2022, when the berm was initially raised. Just looking at that most recent data, before that berm was raised up to 4192, we were around 730 CFS south to north, and then nothing basically north to south. And just a note, the berm was raised to 4192 on February 10th, and so we don't have any data for that period shown here. We have attempted to make a manual discharge measurement at the breach since the berm was raised. March 9th, we were out there. This is the velocity data from our ADCP instrument that we use to make the discharge measurements. And the take-home message with this color plot, we're looking at a cross section of the channel on the north side of the bridge, and the colors in the plot represent the velocity measured by the instrument. And usually when you have a good strong velocity signal, you'll see more uniform stratification of the velocity colors here. So these velocities are all over the place. It's very noisy velocity data. And we don't have high confidence in the output from this measurement. I mean, the software will output a discharge value. We don't have high confidence in it. And here's actually the summary for that measurement. The column that I have highlighted is discharge in cubic feet per second. And so we do many transects. In this measurement, we did 4 transects. So we pulled the boat across the channel 4 different times. And we got discharge measurements for each individual transect. And then the bold 13.85 CFS is the average of those transects. So now let's just go down below the 13.85, and you'll see one of the transects when we pulled the boat from the right side to the left side was -5 CFS. And then when we pulled the boat from the left back to the right, it was 26 CFS. And then when we went back the other direction, it was 5 CFS. And then we went back the other direction, it was 29 CFS. So there's really strong directional bias. This is an example of not a good discharge measurement. The velocities are just not uniform enough for this instrument to provide us a good discharge value in this condition where basically the berm is a dam. There's really not much movement. So we're not going to publish that 13.85 or 13.86 value. We're going to make another measurement. Andy might make the measurement today, or it'll be tomorrow. We have an idea for where to do this measurement. Here's a video of the new of the berm on March 7th. This is a couple days before the discharge measurement was made. This was the water quality crew that was out there, made this video. It's 10, 15 seconds. That water is water that's moving through the berm material from south to north. And we'll get a much wider view here as the camera pans over. So we're standing on the west side and now looking east across the berm. You see the berm is well above the water surface, but you did notice there was water flowing through the riprap material. So the next discharge measurement today or tomorrow, Andy's going to actually just he's going to stand on the berm itself and run the instrument on the north side of the berm and see if we can measure this flow. The measurement data we were looking at on the previous slide was closer to the bridge. So it was between the berm and the bridge. Okay. So hopefully we can get a good discharge measurement on the north side of the berm. An update on the uplooker sensor that's measuring velocities just on the north side of the bridge. So this is an instrument that's sitting on the bottom looking up, collecting data at 10 different cells through the water column and velocity vector information. So we have velocity in feet per second on the y-axis, time on the x-axis for February 2023 out to current information. And so the berm, you see the first arrow I have on the plot, berm raised to 4192 in February, and we saw an impact on our velocity data. We went from mostly positive velocities down to a lot of noise around 0. Well, then by mid-February, tons of noise in the velocity data from our sensor, and this is due to salt crystals caking the instrument. This happens every year when conditions are just right. We have farm brine sitting in that pool, deep in that pool where that instrument is. Temperatures drop, salt cakes the instrument, and we can't get good data. In the past, we pulled the instrument off, chipped the salt off, put it back, but the salt crystals just reform within a day or two, and so it's a waste of time. But you can see out to the right of the plot, the more recent data, that last March value is like March 19th. You see the noise going away, and now we're converging on good data again, and you see some downward spikes for negative velocities. Those are potentially related to wind events, or north arm water is being pushed up over the top of the berm into the south arm. But this instrument is back online. Of course, we're going to put a new instrument in there. This is measuring 10 cells. We're going to put a new instrument there measuring over 200 cells. And we're going to do that by the end of this month or early April. We wanted to wait for this salt period to come and go before putting that new instrument out. All right, and then this is the last slide for the update, and then we'll do homework assignments a little later as Jeff runs the meeting. And I was going to leave it to Scott to explain this if you'd like, but maybe I'll just jump in. I mean, this is the same salinity plot Christina showed at many of our meetings: salinity in grams per liter on the y-axis, time on the x-axis. Triangles are deep samples from 3510, and they're purple for 3510 and orange for 2565. Circles, or excuse me, did I say shallow samples? Triangles are shallow samples. Circles are deep samples, and you can see at the top the legend that you can differentiate between which site. Just look at the most recent data. That's all we're interested in. The most recent data at 2565 and 3510 are actually from February. We don't have new data for March, but in the text to the bottom right in the plot, you see the values range between 165 grams per liter for shallow and 170 grams per liter for shallow for 3510 and 2565. And then the blue text to the right of the plot are the most recent values that we have for salinity. And the most recent value is March 15th from the Saltaire Lake Elevation Gauge, 158 grams per liter from that site. So we're definitely on the way down in terms of salinity, which is excellent news. And then you can see the other values from different locations. We have the New Breach sample was taken on March 7th, and this is from the shallow water. We were at 163 grams per liter, and then a UGS value on February 7th of 167 grams per liter. So values are definitely decreasing right now. And if you look at that latest value, 158, we're below that 160 value and entering the zone where Brian Schiffer potentially are most happy. And that's it for the update. I think we'll wait for the home to discuss our other slides.
Well, let's roll right into that.
All right.
Yes, we've already done Ben's update, so
Okay.
we can move right into that.
So Scott, if you would mind, I'll just click through these.
Whatever, yeah.
All right. Before we do this, can you summarize what our homework assignment was? So hopefully we've got it captured.
Well, the last slide or two speaks directly to one of the questions. The rest of this, I think, is stuff that probably, yeah, I don't know exactly.
So I think with the protocol, there's a couple of key questions for sure a month ago that we were talking about. One is just the historical changes in salinity. How has that changed with water level? This graph illustrates that beautifully. I think that's something that we'll want to talk about. I think where we sample, I think as we're looking at target salinities, it's important that we agree on where we're going to sample it, at what depth are we going to sample it, who's sampling it, have some consensus on that so that we're not wondering about that in the future. And then I think the other key point was just in terms of target salinities, where have we been in relation to the salinity range of 120 to 160? And, when we're looking at the seasonal patterns, what target salinity do we want to have in the fall when we usually see the maximum salinity? And then is there a target for the spring when we typically have our lowest salinity? Okay, use those as measures to help inform what we do with the berm.
Okay, so these slides are going to illuminate some of this for us and facilitate further discussion. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, that's super helpful, Jeff, because the thing you see here is those gray dots that are falling off the pattern is something that we've noticed for a long time in discussions about what's the best way to capture the salinity in the lake at one instant, right? And so, there's the biennial 7 sites, the G-SLEP 4 sites, the breach, the lake level gauges, and we've done a lot of work comparing them, what works. I think the general consensus I would summarize is that we think 3 or 4 sites is nearly as good as 7. And a monthly time snapshot's good enough. But not all sites are created equal. And this just shows that the 2, 2, 6, 7, which we've known for a long time, can be diluted relative to the rest of the lake during, runoff periods, right? So that will either bring your average down or you just ignore it. You say, good news, fresh water. So, I think that just speaks to how you make an average, how you do things, and what a monitoring strategy would be. One of the things that along the way, maybe try the next slide, Ryan.
What are the depth of those?
I think you're half a meter.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So there is some discussion if a meter might be less susceptible for that. But yeah, I don't know. Isn't that right, Ryan?
Yep.
Most of our stuff is
Yep.
half meter, so.
That north end of Antelope, the salinity can change during the day even. Like wind comes in there and we've had that
Yeah.
experience and you just go around Ladyfinger Point, it's completely different. But
Yeah.
like, I've had the morning be a different salinity than the afternoon.
Sure, maybe you've seen ice flows go by.
Yeah, yeah, right. That's a really interesting
Yeah.
site. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I think the one thing when we started in on the lake level gauges and the breach was, well, that's a really low cost way to monitor the salinity. But how much does it tell us about the lake?
Right.
Or do we need a limnological approach, right? To just being out there and saying, well, these sites are different, things are moving. And I think the answer we've come up with is like yes to everything. Like when something doesn't fit, and you just have to pay attention to that. So, and then what? Yeah, so that's the Bear River base. What's the next one, Ryan? Right, and this is basically our decline from November 2022. And this was in that previous one too with the updated salinity values. The deep brine's gone now at this 2565 site. But also then we've seen about a 20 gram per liter decrease at these 2 sites from November to present. So that, and then I think if you go into the next one, Ryan.
And I think it's important to say present. The most recent data on here is from February 7th. So so things are even, there's more of a differential now.
Yeah.
If we were able, we'll know the next time we get a sample of those 2 sites.
And like, for example, at the breach, the February data was 167. And now and then in March it was 163. So several grams per liter probably decline. Okay, so upper left and upper right, these are salinity changes using the sort of foresight network from spring to fall and then fall to spring. So it gives you an idea of the range that you'll see annually, right? So, if you just look, salinity increase from spring to fall, it's always at least 10, right? And one thing's at 40. So that's a range, right, that you could work with. And then, of course, if you look in the salinity decrease, fall to spring, lower right, what you see over the last 12 years is you can get close to 50 grams per liter decrease in big runoff years. So, and if you look at 2011 and 2017, it's pretty obvious, and that this year is probably lining up to look like one of them. But then, the seasonal salinity decreases could be from runoff could be as low as 10 grams per liter in a bad year. This shows the same thing with the Bear River Bay site, right? This is a limnological snapshot, and one site is starting in January and February of this year. We see that site is lower than the rest of the lake. Okay, and then this is the real, I think, the homework calculation that's sort of supportive of adaptive management thinking about the berm.
So I guess to put a pin in on the sites, I guess if I were to summarize that, as it sounds like, I mean, the work that you've done looking at all the data is great, and I think what Christine sent has a lot of even more information on that. What I'm hearing is that it sounds, these 4 that are sampled on a monthly basis provide an idea of the dynamics in the system, but that if we want to evaluate the salinity of the south arm, perhaps 35, 65, and what was the other one? 25 or 35, 10 and 25, 65 would characterize the south arm as and take the average of those 2.
Yeah, I think that would be fair. And I mean, it's always, you always want to know how the average is made.
Right.
Right. So you look at this and you realize, okay, one of these doesn't fit. And I mean, the other thing we spent a good bit of time doing is looking at year over year increases and saying, well, if we were going to say, how much did the salinity change this year? Well, you want to take a 2 or 3 month average from, say, August, September, October. And that the noise, if you look at these on these graphs of salinity, the noise really shrinks that time of year when you're getting close to your maximum salinity, right? So it depends on your objective. If you're looking at year over year changes, you probably want to say between these 2 years, the maximum salinity, we could get 12 or 15 values in there based on different months and different samplings, and they're all really tight. So it depends on the objective. If you're looking at year over year trends, that's probably the strategy. If you're looking at short-term seasonal trends, I mean, my personal opinion, Christina, I've talked a lot about this, is you take every single scrap of data you can as it comes in, and you know what doesn't make sense. And you have to just be watching it. Yeah.
Maybe a comment on that is, we find the same thing is that geographical variation in the spring is much higher than it is in the summer. But we do, and we have seen, and I think Phil mentioned it in one of the meetings, that at 3 meter depth, there's much less variability than at 1 meter depth. And we sample at, 1, 3, and 5 meter. So we kind of, and we can present that data at some point if that's valuable, but that's kind of what we're seeing.
Right. And so another question might be, do you want monitoring that's representative of inflow of the lake freshman? In which case, half a meter, a meter might be useful. Or are you going for,
And that will be important in a little bit.
Yep. Okay, and then I think the last slide or 2 is just the sort of this conceptual dilution, adaptive management scenario. And this is really just the sort of mass balance framework that Christine used to predict what your new concentration or volume will be, mostly by moving volumes around. So, and of course, the thing to realize in this is everything happens instantaneously. So we raise lake level instantaneously. There's no evaporation. It's sort of a steady state assumption. There's no transients. It's a really crude look at it, but I think one of the things we'll get to is pretty useful. So how about the next one, Ryan? So then these are, so what Christine did is she just said, okay, we're going to fill the lake to exactly 4192. We're not going to spill any South Arm brine to the north. And then we're going to calculate a new salinity for that. And that's going from step 1 to step 2, I believe. And then in step 3 and 4, she sort of walks through scenarios of then sending South Arm brine to the north and then watching, what would happen in the following spring, say 2024. So let's see what the next one is, Ryan.
Well, let's just, so on the first step of this, by spring 2023, given the assumptions that Scott, he summarized on behalf of Christine, spring 2023, 147 grams per liter. Okay. So, keeping that number in mind as we move along.
And then this is the scenarios of the decline, essentially. And this is what you basically use to say, we instantaneously move the top 2 or 3 feet of water to the north arm. And then what happens? And so, yeah, here's your fall of 2023 salinities.
Sorry, guys, you're getting my teeth.
I was like, is Mike on the meeting or just on your
No,
computer?
I just want something.
Teams just takes over your computer.
And Scott, I would just say these run 2 scenarios there. So the second diamond on a 2-foot decline and a 3-foot decline.
Yep.
Is this due to evaporation or is this due to?
Yeah, I guess that's evaporation.
There you go. Okay.
Yep.
So that's just losing 2 feet of water or 3 feet of water, 3 feet of water from the south arm due to evaporation. And so a 2-foot decline, if we look at the table below, we move over to fall of 2023 salinity, we get 170 grams per liter. A 3-foot decline, we get 183 grams per liter. And then the last column is the 147 to put those 2 numbers in perspective. 147 from spring, the beginning of the scenario.
So you're saying we could go as high as 183. So it's going to be likely in that range, 170 to 183.
Well, given the limitations there's big assumptions that the south arm, basically the volume of water that comes in the south arm gets us up to 4192 and then stops.
It's only another foot, so.
Yeah.
I mean, but it's a hypothetical. It's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
It's not.
We're gonna,
Right, and then the assumption, and when we get to this ISO mass plot that we've been working with,
Yeah.
the assumption is the mass in solution stays in solution, the water goes away.
Right.
So you're just decreasing volume and thereby increasing concentration.
If you have the volume difference that you had in 2011, you might get up to 4194 on the south arm. And that would improve things quite a bit.
But then this is
But that's a max.
very conceptual because you're sending dilute water to the north in that scenario.
Yeah, that's true. There you go.
And this is the drawdown. So
Yes, and then this is the instantaneous export to the north arm,
Yeah.
right? And then so on the far right, which you look at, using that lake level drawdown, you get and the elevations, you get a volume that leaves. Using that predicted fall concentration, that tells you a mass of salt that is moved from the south to the north. And sort of, I think the way to think about it is, unless you precipitate halite, the mass in solution in the south arm is constant, right? There's a little bit of inflow, but it doesn't even matter compared to the resident mass. So one way to consider keeping the south arm in an optimum salinity range is every time you get a chance, send salt mass to the north. And this is a scenario where Christine said, okay, we can send between 150 and 230 megatons of dissolved solids to the north arm.
Megatons. That's what it is. Yeah.
And then I think the next thing is just the graph. Right. So there's the 1, 2, 3, 4, and the question about spring 2024. And in this is concentration on the X, volume on the Y, and then each of those gray lines in the back is just a conserved resident mass in the south arm, right? So if you had, inflow, basically dilution, you would be driving the volume up and the salinity down, and it would follow one of those gray lines, basically. And the same thing if you had evaporation, right? You'd be driving volume down and concentration up, so you'd be going the opposite direction on one of those gray lines. And if you want to move salt mass out of the south arm, for example, as a management objective, you want to go orthogonal to or across those gray lines, or reduce the salt mass in the south arm. So that would be from 3 to 4, right? That's your instantaneous export of, several hundred megatons.
But you're measuring in megatons, and we're measuring in grams per liter, and that doesn't bother you.
No, because the graph shows what, if you change the megatons,
Yeah.
you're on a new line, you're on a new graph, and that shows you where your grams per liters are going to be at different
I
elevations.
know, I just.
This is the same as
Yeah,
Phil's
period.
plot, basically.
No,
They're
this is
different.
the best way to do it. I
Yeah.
totally agree.
Yeah,
So, but the point is, the real thing that, and Christine, you could chime in, but she came to me a little with a bit of consternation.
Yeah.
Because she said, we do all of this, and it's sure it's a hypothetical, and we do all this adaptive management, we hold all the fresh water we can, and then we wait until it's really concentrated, and then we do our most effective, export of salt when it's most concentrated. And then immediately we close it back up and capture inflows beginning, say, December or something. And then we're slowly ratcheting the salt mass in the South Arm down. So you can be at lower concentrations at lower lake levels. But she said, if you go through all these machinations, by spring of 2024, through her various calculations, we only at an equivalent lake level, we only lowered the concentration 4 grams per liter. And we talked about that some, and kind of our discussion was like, exactly, this is a long-term approach, right? It's like you're ratcheting. And so this year might look great, but it's really just an opportunity.
Well, I think that's
Absolutely.
but I think it's important to compare this against if we did nothing. If we didn't do, I can see it is a little disappointing that we're not moving the needle further, we're not moving it further.
The right direction.
It's
It's
going
the
in the
right
right
direction.
direction. And if I think if we didn't do it, then the salinity would be higher.
Well, it's a lot of mass that's being moved.
Yeah.
We have a huge south arm. We're moving a lot of mass out of there, but we have a huge south arm. So in terms of talking massive volumes of water, concentration changes are not as big as,
right.
Are
That's
we
why
also
that graph
delaying
is.
the uptick of concentration in the spring by holding it in the south arm, so it gives the brine shrimp cysts and the ecology a little longer, time to function at the right levels before we release it. So even though we're only doing the, 4 grams per liter, there's that time benefit as well.
I think another thing that this demonstrates, if you look at today's situation where we anticipate much more inflow than the hypothetical, it sort of points towards, let's wait until the major inflows have happened and maybe spillover has happened, and then do the analysis of, what we would want to hypothetically do looking forward, rather than making, those decisions too early before we actually know what happened in reality.
I think this water year is such a great chance to do this experiment. Not that we had a choice in the matter.
We may not be able to do it. If we have too much spillover, then, we may be to a
Right.
point where we're
Right.
barely holding back, the heavy brine from the north. We don't know.
Yeah,
Or, Andrew, how much would we have to dilute the North Arm to then mobilize Hayline?
Well, so that's kind of conceptually, that's
Because this is like 2017 when they opened the breach potentially.
right.
And
So,
2 years later, we see it coming back, or 3 years later, but not instantaneously.
Yeah, but we only saw it coming back because we deepened that management burden.
That's right.
We can keep it at
That's
a
right.
higher level.
Well, and here's another issue. If you have something like 2011, and that volume comes into the lake, you're going to have North Arm brine coming back into the south again.
that's probably what we need to watch because, conceptually, I keep kind of stepping back and thinking, really the mechanism, and I've probably said this before, and please stop me if I'm thinking about this incorrectly, but the mechanism that allows there to be an ecosystem in the South Arm is the fact that there's all this salt being precipitated in the North Arm. And
Sure,
so
essentially, yeah.
what we need to do is maximize the precipitation and not trip ourselves by, so what I guess the one concern I have is if we, in this model, we'll be surging the North Arm with brine, and that may be the best way to dissolve a big chunk of salt. And so it may not, because things will be different. We're hopefully going to have the berm high enough so that we don't have the return flow. And we'll be stopping that flow so that there's not a constant input from the south arm. So hopefully we won't have that scenario. But I think as we do this, we need to watch and make sure that, yeah, we're not mobilizing a bunch of salt when we flush the north arm, because it may be better off long term that we have a slow trickle rather than doing these surge events. So that may be
This for
another
dissolution.
that may be another option down the road if this seems to be problematic. And I think this is going to be okay because we're not going to have the return flow, and we're going to be stopping the constant flow over the course of the year. So I think this is going to be okay, but it's just something that we need to.
And a consideration with that though is you don't want to send South Arm Brine north until it's most concentrated.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It has
So
minimum dilution power, but also you get the most effective transfer of mass per unit volume through that breach.
November, or
that's
December,
true,
or something like that.
But do you still have the head difference to make
Well, and that's the other thing is you have to make sure the head difference.
and to balance that?
Yeah. Yeah.
So Scott, you may have, if you have a huge flow and it's, if you would have asked me a month ago, I would say, I don't think so. But I mean, if you have like a 2011, you're gonna that berm is gonna be under 2 feet of water, and you're gonna the north and south are gonna be pretty much equalized. So you will be sending the very dilute water over to the north. And I don't know if we need to. Do
Well,
you
I
need
mean,
to adjust anything?
Well,
to
that's the
account?
whole thing with that site 2267. That's all the fresh water from Bear River coming in, going along the causeway and going through the breach, so it short circuits. It's not well mixed. I mean, that's another principle. I think you don't want to plan a big transfers through this breach until the lake is well mixed. You know what you have, right? And when you overtop the breach, you're preferentially sending fresh water north.
And we weren't really precipitating halite significantly again until 2020. So from 2017 to 2020, there was very minimal halite precipitation.
So I think a couple of key variables here are, one is the lake level and the flow of the south arm and the north arm is going to dictate how much water we can move. That head difference is going to tell us how much water we can move. The salinity of the south arm is going to be a guideline to tell us if we need to do something or not. And then the salt mass that we compute for the south arm, and what we can target is going to be the other key variable. And then the berm elevation, when you throw that in the mix with the hydraulics, is going to help tell us how much salt mass we can physically move. And I think the thing that keeps coming into my mind, and I think is reflected in this draft protocol, is that we don't know any of those things at this point, and we won't know any of these things until after we probably hit the peak lake level this spring, summer.
Jeff, can you go back to the slide to show the volumes that would be transferred under the.
While we're doing that, let me ask Andrew a question. So without having a stir bar in the north arm, where we could stir things into solution, that localized flushing, do you really think it would dissolve enough salt because of the lack of mixing with the more saturated brine?
So, in 2017, we saw significant dissolution all the way up to the spiral jetty.
Okay.
Does that answer?
Yeah.
Significant.
Okay.
I think again, what Andrew points out is that if we manage the burn properly, we can limit the return flow. Then that's not so.
That's correct. Yeah.
And we've done a decent job of doing that last year, with the computational fluid mechanic dynamic modeling.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
That's going to be a pretty, not complaining about it, but that's a pretty significant opening to move 1 million acre feet in months. So I think we right.
That's the other
We just need to think through the logistics of that.
Yeah, I'm
That
still
may be
trying
the
to
target, but that's a 150-foot wide opening. And that feels like a pretty, again, from my perspective, we want that connection, but we just need to understand the reality that to Andrew's point is kind of a constant flow,
Yeah.
more executable. If we're talking about moving 1 million acre feet, I mean, that's most of what we bring into the lake annually.
Right.
So-
From Fort River.
800,000, yeah.
From December 1, 2016 to June 10, 2017, the North Arm rose a little over 5 feet. So it took 6 months for that 5-foot rise.
Uh-huh.
So, I mean, the head difference was different then. So, I mean,
What season was that? When did it, what was?
so it opened in December, I think December 1st, 2016.
Oh, when the, yeah. Okay.
And then, yeah, and
And so
It
through
went
the
up 5
spring.
feet.
And the first discharge measurement was made when it was open to something like 8,000 CFS. And it was quickly down to 5,000. And then it kind of stabilized at like 1,000 out there for the next 6 months or so.
So 1,000 is probably a good number to do this.
I mean, it often flows when we had the bidirectional stuff, 500 to 750 was common. So, yeah.
Yeah, but if the intent is like not to have the north to south return flow, you might need a giant opening in order to move this. And that may be part and parcel with that unless you kind of have a managed flow.
And this does not assume any sequestration of salt with the brine extractors?
Yeah, I don't think that's.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it does not assume anything
It's a
about.
lot.
So I think, I'm just thinking about some of the key things that we're talking about here is one is that a lot is to be able to calculate the actual salt mass of water volume that we can, or that we want to, but then is also physically possible to move to the North Arm. It's something that I guess we can pregame. We can go through a whole bunch of different scenarios and combinations and everything. But in reality, we're going to have to wait until probably June, July timeframe to be able to say, okay, here's what we can move and what we want to move. And that's premised on the fact that, and I'm not hearing any disagreement that lowering the berm to export salt to the North Arm is a bad idea. I'm not hearing anything say that. So then I think the next step is if we have those variables, and I know we could talk through that for a long time. I think a key decision point is going to be the salinity in the spring, because that's going to tell us, how much salt do we want to move to the North Arm, and then the question is after that is how much can we, and that'll help fix a berm height and give us a reality check as to what we can actually do. But I think I want to talk a little bit about the salinity in the spring, and Craig, I think I had a great curve and I added a little.
Yeah, the curve.
Hey, just real quick too, I just want to make sure as well that we are going to have adequate time to get into this protocol, because we really need to get something done today. So as far as the homework assignments go, if we can attempt to try to make them quick, I think that would be good for that discussion.
I think we are tackling the protocol as we're going. 'Cause I think that principle of doing the calculations of salt mass that we want to move, and doing that calculation in the summer, repeating that calculation again in the fall, when we see what the maximum is, I think is a critical. That's the foundation of this whole thing. I think then of this strategy. I think then the next items are, what are the target salinities that we want to have, and I think that's, so your point's well taken, because yes, I agree. We want to try to button this up. I think these are critical pieces of that framework. So in terms of the salinity that we might want to have, I guess the straw man that I had thrown out there was that, at 160 would be where we want to kind of the target at the top end that we want to see in the fall. That was where, that's the upper end of the range that we talked about on the matrix. But I think that's, I guess, any thoughts on that? Because I think that's an important number in this protocol.
I mean, my thoughts are, and they're not really mine, they're Gary Bolovsky's, is that that's probably already too high from an
Agreed.
optimal perspective, which is what we're looking at.
But I think we agreed on that as a committee is the where we sound the alarms, right? Is that,
Well, we agreed on that, several years ago, right? With what we knew then. In
Right.
the meantime, Gary's been doing quite a lot of work, looking at reproduction and,
yes.
looking at growth and
And same in our lab in terms of the things that the shrimp eat and the same the things that the flies eat. The salinity is much lower than we thought. So I agree with that, but I don't know how much we can tweak that at this point in terms of protocol, but we should.
No, I'm not saying to tweak it. What I'm saying is that, the way that it reads now is the optimal is, 12 to 16 or 120 to 160.
And it really
With
should
what
be
we know
150,
today,
150.
I think it's more like, 90 to 150.
Yeah, the microbial mats are already sloughing off and dying at 150 in our lab. So I would agree with that in terms of all that I've been reading recently.
And I'm not suggesting to per se change
Yeah.
these limits today. I'm
Yeah.
just saying that if we're going to use terminology of optimal, then given what we know today and didn't know 3-4 years ago, 9 to 15 is, most likely that
So
range.
these-
At least I'm talking brine shrimp.
Yeah, yeah, but I
normally.
think it's for everything, really. I mean, as we're looking at this more and more, right? So if 160 is suboptimal, maybe we label it as something that maybe we keep it because it's the number we've been working around for the moment, but that we label it as.
Could we call it the compromised salinity? Because I think that's truly what it is, right? This is what it is. Everybody kind of came to the table and decided they could accept.
The
Definitely not
compromised
optimal.
salinity. I'd rather talk about
Well,
the framework of the biology.
The compromised range, the 120 to
It's not like
160.
the shrimp are like, well, I could do with this. It's all right,
It
Nobody
was
else.
already a compromise at the low end then too.
Yeah, that's
We were trying to support the extraction industries in the South.
I would rather have a database term such as suboptimal. Restrictive isn't quite right. I mean, when we get to like 19, 20%, 190 to 200, then we're talking about restrictive. But so restrictive isn't quite right. Suboptimal might be. Are you okay with that word?
Well, I think in the context of this protocol, it's a target that we don't want to exceed.
Right.
And I think what you're getting at, I think is something else that I think is an agenda item for perhaps our next meeting.
Yep.
Is talking about those values on the matrix and how we characterize those.
Yeah,
those
and getting
numbers.
back to tweaking those.
Yeah. But I think in terms of the protocol here, we're trying to set some targets for where that can help inform action.
Yeah.
And I think, and frankly, the easiest number to peg is that upper end of that range that identical of 160. And so that's what's in this draft protocol, is that we would want to be below 160 fall.
I like that you put a time on it too. That's critical because that means it was less than that during the time when a lot of the reproduction was happening.
And Bonnie, I agree with you that in terms of biology, a compromise is not a good terminology.
Right.
But in terms of what we actually are doing here,
Yeah.
compromise is probably, an accurate way to describe it.
Yeah, but if we get to this database stuff and evidence
Yeah,
based and that, then we need to use those kind of words. That's all I'm saying.
I
Yeah.
agree.
Oh, that's a good point. So if we put a pin on that 160 as the upper target, then the question is, well, where do we want that lower target to be? And so one of the homework items, Craig ran his whiz bang
Lots of assumptions.
algorithms, which is fantastic because there's a lot that we don't know, but this is based on what we do know. And he came up with these different curves. And so the question really is, well, what spring salinity will achieve the target fall salinity is, so the target, if the target is 160, he had, let's see, he ran a target of 150 and 160. So the blue and the orange, these upper two, are assuming a target of 160 in the fall, and then the yellow and the green are assuming a target of 150. And then he ran those at assuming a drop of 2.4 feet and 3.1.
That's the average generally. And then 3.1 is about, well, it's close to the maximum that you've ever seen.
I'm sorry, I should be letting you explain.
No, that's fine. You're doing great.
Well, correct, jump in. So so when we look at if 160 is our target for the fall, and we want to try to get there, what are we backing into, knowing that as the lake evaporates, this salinity is concentrating. Where do we want to be in the spring? And so one thing, I guess, when on the USGS plot of history, as one thing I saw is that when we're below 4192 has been when we've been concerned. That's when the alarm bells started to go off. And so that seems to be an important elevation, in this, in our discussion about salinity South Arm. So if we take that same 4192 and draw a line across there, then what we can see is if we have a large drop from evaporation of 3.1, if we're below 130, then we should, I guess, I don't think we can forecast the probability, but we can say is based on these numbers is that we would be at or below 160 at a low lake elevation. Again, if we only have 2.4 feet of drop, then we would only need to be at 135. And so that was one data point. And then I guess if we're targeting a lower salinity like 150, then the spring salinity needs to be lower, which is logical. So this was I think one data point I think is important just from doing the mass balance calculations that he did with looking at different lake levels and different salt masses. What do we need to have in the spring to hit that 160? And so you can see here, it depends on how much evaporation we have, but anywhere between 127 and 135 is where we want to be in the spring. So I think that's, any questions on that? I want to keep moving forward. There's a story here, I guess, that I see coming together. All right. So then the next part of the story is something that that Phil and Thomas and others have been working on in terms of why is that spring number important? And so I wanted, so they did some work, and you want to
Sure.
run through these?
Yeah, because the spring salinity is being considered as a factor. It's important for the hatching rate for the Artemia cysts because cysts don't hatch at a salinity that the adults can survive at. So it does become a crucial factor. But information on what hatching rate is at salinity on Great Salt Lake population specifically is not something where there's an abundance of data. We have some information from some prior experiments that were done in prior years, and it was kind of an incidental factor that was measured. And this is where the cysts that were used in this study we're hatching around 40% at 100 grams per liter, but it declined to very low levels by 120 and then essentially nothing after 130 grams per liter. And so we wanted to try to test that again with contemporary cysts and see if we could repeat that result. So we did that just last week, essentially. And what we did is we took a high quality reference cyst that we have from, I think, the year 2019 that we know hatches at a higher rate under optimal conditions. And we gathered a composite sample of cysts from this prior year, 2022. And we hatched them in a variety of brine concentrations using laboratory-made brine. And that becomes somewhat important here because we want to emphasize that these are not definitive results by any means. This was a fairly quick experiment we were able to set up since the last SAC meeting. And it's a starting point, though. And so we hatched them. The two graphs on the left are the high-quality reference cysts. The column graph shows the hatching rate at 24 hours in the light blue, 48 hours in the dark blue, and then 72 hours in the yellow, in salinities ranging from 70 tested up to 160. And what this graph shows is that at higher salinities, not only does the hatching rate decline, but the ultimate hatching rate, but then the speed at which the hatching occurs. You can see that when you compare the 24 to 72 hours. So at higher salinities, the hatching progresses much more slowly. And so by 110 and 120 grams per liter, you're not getting any hatching at all within a 24-hour period. And so it demonstrates that the hatching progression is much slower. If you look at, you graph this data to show essentially a threshold effect on this bottom graph, where the salinity range is extended to beginning at 20 grams per liter and moving through that 160 gram per liter range. And there's a very sharp drop off in this test at 100 grams per liter, minimal hatching at 120 and none detected at 130 and above those cysts. For the current year 2022 cysts on the graph on the right, a similar pattern is seen in an exponential drop off, essentially a threshold effect. And for those cysts, it appears that minimal hatching is achieved at even slightly lower salinity, closer to 110 grams per liter in that test. And so in a way, it does confirm those prior results that salinity has a very sharp impact on the hatching rate of Artemia cysts across that range. And we also want to look back at field data, since we have a really large gradient in salinity just over the past few years in the lake. And so we looked at the population progression that we measured in our routine program on the lake for the last 3 years, 2020, which is the black line, 2021, the orange line, and 2022. Spring salinities in 2020 were about 120 grams per liter. In 2021, we moved up to 146, and then 2022, 160 grams per liter. And on the y-axis is essentially just a measure of the Artemia population size to give a good visual demonstration of how many Artemia of all age classes standardized there were in the lake. And we can see with the black line in 2020, we got a substantial population showing up in early April. In both 2021 and 2022, that population didn't show up until early June. And so you have a very conspicuous 2-month window in that lake where there essentially are no live free-swimming Artemia population. And so any ecosystem services that population is providing is essentially not occurring for those 2 months when in prior years it would have. And so the effect of salinity on hatching rate and population progression is evident also in the field data. So I want to throw that out there. More testing, I think, is warranted on hatching rate with salinity, and we'd like to actually do that using lake water instead of laboratory solutions. So I think Kyle beat you on it.
Just a point to clarify for those people that maybe don't speak French anymore. And then when you're talking about your lab experiments at the 110, 120, that's going to be mixed in that water column at 120 and not accounting for a freshwater lens.
Exactly.
Yeah. Whereas the ones in the lake will experience that freshwater lens.
Yes.
And that could account. So that's why you're seeing hatching even occurring at the 160 in the lake, not.
Yeah, the higher the salinity goes, the more dependent that population
Really
is on there being a
dependent
substantial spring runoff to help it overcome that salinity.
That was my question.
Awesome.
Great.
And then both speak brandy or both.
Jeff, I don't know if you're planning on showing that graphic that Gary shared at all.
No, I don't.
So Gary has a similar thing that exactly mirrors this with his experiments over the last 25 years, over 5,000 experiments. And he shows this exact same relationship. You get better hatching. And then the other thing that he tracked was survival from nauplii to juvenile to adult. And it's really dependent on that lower salinity to even survive. And that's why this flat line that we see in 2022, that window that Phil talks about between April and June, it really, they're hatching at that time frame, but they're not surviving and they're not transitioning. So that's the concern that we're seeing. That's why the springtime salinity is really, really important, that we get it as low as we can.
Yeah. Do we have any avian data to kind of overlay on this to see if, to kind of look at?
Nothing official, because we do all of our avian counts mostly in the fall timeframe. And then what coordinated bird monitoring we do, that happens in April. And nothing over the lake directly. I mean, we do a few flights, and so we would have some cursory stuff that we can put. But a lot of times what we see is, especially for the eared grebes, which is kind of our poster child for the South Arm, is when they get here this early in the spring, the brine shrimp haven't typically hatched in numbers where they're going to be useful as a food source. And we see the birds moving on. And then, so it's, Great Salt Lake is a stopover, but it's not a significant food source stopover in the spring.
That's more for those that stay around in the fall.
Yeah, it's mostly for when they're coming back through. We need to get the shrimp to hatch so that they're there as adults in the fall when they come back into their molt.
Does a delay in hatching affect that, the population?
We think so, is whether that residence time of how many bird use days we'll see in the spring is probably tied to whether we have a significant brine shrimp hatch early in the year or later in the year.
So we don't have data to say if there's been an impact over the
No, I don't think we have anything.
I would leave your house if you had no food for me.
Essentially,
Yeah,
yes.
I'm just, we're talking a lot about laboratory data. I'm just understanding we've gone through some rough times.
Yeah.
But I'm just asking, has there been impacts to?
I think to be clear, if you look at the data, that you have for the avian population, there is a significant correlation between the last 2 to 3 years of diminished brine shrimp population and the overall avian population. And that's not only the grebes, there's other birds and significant, other species. Is that a causation? Well, that's always a question in science. A correlation doesn't per se mean a causation, but there's a high probability here that there is a causation. Yes, at least according to the avian experts. I'm not one.
And brine shrimp survivability will also relate to their food supply, right? The algae, we have data on that, seasonal.
Yeah, and the algae is actually high, and it's there. And algae population is high. The brine shrimp are not grazing it because they're not surviving.
John Lowe's chiming in here because I guess his microphone is broken, but he wants to point out that the overall population of fowler have declined over the last few years. So that those peak counts that we
Do
see.
you know what those numbers are? Decline?
I don't off the top of my head, no.
Yeah, those are really concerning, and Wilson's rate is the one that we're the
Wilson's is
most
the main,
concerned
but
about.
also
Yeah.
John's saying about half. So
About half, okay. All right.
I will say some of the other thing, anecdotally, use areas we're seeing, especially grebes, but a lot of the other birds. We see more grebes in the freshwater wetlands, the impounded wetlands, in the springtime than we ever used to. Talking with all the different area managers as they go around and we do our spring counts, we do see more grebes off the lake than we used to, especially.
So Jeff and I have been really nerding out about osmoregulation in birds and not even thinking about their limited food source or the fact that they have to relocate to eat, which are also stressors, but also just their ability to get rid of the salt that they ingest when they eat, because now they're ingesting more salt, right? And their salt glands aren't able to pump it out as much. So the cost of osmoregulation is real, even for the birds, I think.
Well, in the interest of time, I think I thought it was, I don't know if it's just coincidence, but it was great to see that the numbers that, from what Craig calculated, and then when we look at these numbers here, is that, and this reason why you see 130 as a target for the spring in the draft protocol is that's where that comes from. It's not just, we didn't just pull it out of the air. I was looking at both what, again, I don't think 130 is optimal for brine shrimp, but what can we do in the spring? Reasonable is a good word. A target salinity for the spring that we can try to achieve in the spring so that we don't exceed 160 or give us the best chance of not exceeding 160 in the fall, but also give the brine shrimp as much of a chance to hatch in the spring. So that's where that 130 number came from. So that becomes the target for the spring. Yeah, Ben?
Yeah, I have a question with, given this new information, some of the discussions you guys have had about questioning our range. It seems like the 120 is kind of out of this year's realm to achieve. So I just wonder why we even, if there's uncertainty about our lower number, how do we have a 120 in here?
So good question, because that's the next point in the protocol is the 120. I guess what we're trying to do also is protect the other uses that we have in the lake, and with the mineral extraction, and that was, when we look at the range of 120 to 160 is, and I think this goes, if we look back in time, we look at those the salinities when we had water levels above 4192. I think when this committee first started, I think our concern at that time was actually that we were exporting too much salt to the North Arm. It seems like forever ago now, but that, we were enjoying water levels of 4195 plus back then. And we didn't even conceive of the fact that we'd be down at this point. But I think, so that's part of what, that's, I guess, another key underlying principle to this protocol is that, this is a draft, or this is our initial protocol. And it's something that as we monitor, as we continue to monitor, as we continue to go through these calculations of salt mass, as we continue to look at the research that's being done at these higher salinities, understand what the impacts are to different uses, all that new information is going to keep feeding into this, and as information that this committee can keep evaluating. So the 120 number is to say, what, we don't want to overshoot. And so if we're at 120, then we need to be thinking about, we still need to be thinking about what can we do with berm if we're at 120. So I think, if, and I hope and pray Craig is right, that we have a 2011 runoff or inflow to the lake, and we do see water levels of 4194. We might be having a different discussion in 6 months.
Laura is going to set up a pool.
Like a dunk? Are you talking like a dunk tank pool and I can throw 3 balls?
Yeah.
Jim.
No, I was just going to say, just speaking to what you were saying about that lower end, and I wasn't part of the original group back when you started negotiating that range, but is there a timing associated with that? Because is it summertime at levels below 120, or is it spring? Because you could have both. You could go below the 120 in the spring and satisfy one use and hit that target later because of the fluctuation of 30.
I think it was a spring. That's when we see the low salinity in the lake.
Mark, when do you guys turn on your pumps to start putting water in your ponds?
When we have water, I guess. US Mag is typically pumped over the winter time and done a semi-batch process on filling and then evaporating over the summertime, and then refill in the fall.
I'm just curious to the extent that, like what Ben's talking about, we were to go down to like 100 grams per liter, after spring runoff, but the idea is that we keep it below 160 and, above 120 in the fall. is that, like, if we were 135, 140 grams per liter come January or February, does that still meet the needs of US Mag as far as?
Well, I mean,
being within that
we're
range?
after the minerals, same thing with the other users on the lake. And we've been able to reduce our take on the lake because the concentration's been up. We lower the concentration, it's going to take more volume in order to meet that same mineral tonnage. And so we'll pump longer, basically, is what will happen.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, and I'd just like to comment and to your comment, Ben, is that I'm not advocating that today we change the 120 to 160 per se. I just want to make clear to the committee that it is a compromise from the brine shrimp industry's perspective. And for us, these numbers of 13 and 16 are truly existential. When we have a few more years like that, we might as well close our doors. So for us, just to be clear, it is a compromise. Just wanted to put that out there.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that the 120 to 160 is more relevant in the fall where we leave off, because that allows the US Mag to stay within that range of where that compromise range. It allows the brine shrimp to hopefully not get towards that top end, but like be in that supportive range. And then as far as spring goes, if we have a runoff year like this, like if we were to start at 4194, we'd probably be well below 120, and it'd be a shame to be bringing the berm down to 4187 again, just to try to bring the salinity up and then have the following year crash the bottom end again. So it seems to me like that release of water is advantageous, but trying to keep the levels of the two sides as close to possible as we can. But that bottom doesn't seem like it's as important as.
Yeah, I mean, particularly when do we think under any scenario in 2023 that you would actually want to bring salt back into the South Arm? Because that's one of your outcomes.
But
on here. So that's question that.
And maybe to also put a thought on that, you had the 4190, the low lake level paradigm, and I think the this low lake level paradigm, it makes a lot of sense to try to control the top end of the salinity, but it's not as clear about how the bottom end would work. And I would suggest that under this paradigm, we treat this like a short-term solution, and maybe this is just, we call it like an interim, or we put a sunset on this one, and over the coming year, we try to develop a more robust protocol where we have like a higher lake paradigm as well. Because I don't think we can put a one-size-fits-all solution to this where we're importing salt or exporting. So I don't know how.
From a mineral extraction standpoint, we have probably 3 or 4 paradigms operating scenarios, right? And it's very different, because if you're bringing in much more concentrate into your system, the precipitation happens at different places, because places relate to time. So yeah, that this really shouldn't be prescriptive for.
And maybe just one other thing is, coming into this fairly new, I came in at the end of 2021, but when the 120 to 160 grams per liter was set, I don't think it even mentioned the time of the year that was appropriate. And so we've come a long ways. Now we know this is really damn important to get the timing right as well on that. And so I think at this point, we're kind of dealing with the information we have, but I do think we should probably, consider this a solution for this year. Have a protocol for what this is going to look like when we release water. We know that that's going to be advantageous. We also know Compass is going to have issues if we keep water in the South Arm. We may not even have to release water if we hit Craig's numbers, but we've also doubled down with USGS on some additional monitoring, and we intend to identify gaps in our protocols and of our monitoring and things, so folks can have data driven solutions. But I do think that we should probably sunset this and say, like, maybe this protocol is good through the end of the evaporation season this year, or after we've made our last modification to the berm to bring it back up and impound that water, we hit the books and try to come up with something new and a little more complex.
I think no plan survives contact with the enemy. Is where we're going to be. We're going to be wrong.
Yeah.
And so it would be nice to see the actual effect of the berm over a season before we concrete something that we have to dismantle later.
Yeah, we've made significant adjustments to the system and really haven't had a full, robust period of time to assess how the lake is responding.
We would definitely be supportive of that.
And
I don't know about the other groups around the table.
And I think in the interim, there's a lot of things that this body can do as well to start addressing some of those, like identifying those gaps in measurement that we need to, to identify so we can make a better decision for a plan, and considering different paradigms for which we're managing. But as we dive into this protocol, maybe we could keep that in mind, that this is kind of a short-term solution, and we're really kind of looking at the upper end this year, because that's the problem in the yard.
So I want to pivot to the protocol, and I guess I want to make sure, or I guess see if there are any significant concerns with this draft protocol. I think the key principles are that we're going to probably in June after spring runoff, the summer sometime, be looking at, well, where is the water level in the south arm and the north arm? What is the salt mass, estimated salt mass in the south arm? Where is this going to be? Where did we see salinity this spring? Calculating, probably going through the numbers with Craig's equations. What do we think the salinity might be in the fall? And then looking at the what if does it make sense to lower the berm? But what the protocol does is it says, we're going to evaluate this this summer, look at these targets of 160, 130, 120, use that as kind of our measuring stick at this point, and then make a recommendation to forestry fires they can. And the premise is, I think this is, again, in kind of the paradigm we've been in the last year, so is low lake paradigm, is that if we're in a condition, I think especially with the data that USGS presented today, is that lowering the berm at the optimal condition or time this fall, our late summer time period, is an opportunity where we may have the opportunity to export salt to the north. And that's all premised on where the water levels are. And the quantity or the mass that we can export is going to be dependent on how much time we can keep that berm open. And then I think then the next step is we're continuing to observe salinity in the fall, and then based on the target, with I guess using what the USGS went through those calculations, is that we would repeat the exercise of bringing the berm back up to 4192. That's something that we would evaluate in the November timeframe. And make a recommendation then as to, yes, it makes sense to raise the berm again to try to dilute the salt mass that's left in the south arm.
I think I'd like to understand the volumes better in relation to what the resulting lake level drop is, because I'm not sure I align with if you release 1 million acre feet into the north arm, that's actually a lot. That would result in a much greater reduction of the water elevation to the south. You only lose about 500,000 acre feet over 500,000 acre feet gives you about 2 feet of play, whereas 1 million acre feet. Again, there's a timing piece.
Yes.
Because 1 million acre feet is a lot to move through, and we want the connection. We rely on that connection, but we shouldn't wait too long to understand that paradigm. And because if we need to start doing that sooner than later, then something we should think about.
I think your point's very well taken. Is that I don't think we should approve this protocol and then reconvene in July and see what happens. I think we have the idea. I think to Ben's point is that we want to get I like the term interim protocol in place, and this is something that we can work with, and but we're going to continue to test it and prove its efficacy, and see if and how we can improve it.
Jeff, if I read the protocol right, then to Ben's point, the only thing we will change in here is the back of the first page, take out at the bottom, in the bottom box number 2, you maintain when you have south arm at or about 120 grams per liter. Given that none of us think we're going to reach that one, and given that we're looking at it as a short term, that's the only thing we can take out. Is that right?
In my perspective, it seems to me like it's more important to be above 120 grams per liter in the fall than it is in the front end, because if we do that, according to Craig's calculations, like, 120 in the spring, we're going to go up 35 grams per liter. It almost puts us above the 160. So we have about 10 grams per liter of play, which at that point, it's like, there's not enough manipulation in the world for us to try to do that balancing act. So I think we're just setting ourselves up, for failure. So not having that bottom end, where the low lake paradigm, I think makes sense, or setting it for the fall. So we try to stay within the operational needs of USMAG is what I would suggest. But I want to make sure that this is amenable to all the beneficial uses, that we find something that does meet the needs.
And for us, it would be setting it in the fall, either or.
And that might just be a simple adjustment to the language, is that, we're just trying to hit 120 to 160 in the fall. And it's temporary. Again, I think we put a sunset on this and we revisit this maybe by this time next year, when we're talking about when we would go relower it again. We would have a new protocol that's already adopted.
I like that.
In the examples and the decision flow, I think I've said this before, but we really need to arrive at common nomenclature, target, optimal, best, critical, functional, emergency. But these things mean very different things to different uses, people, and users of the data. Yeah. And then I think we need to come back to what is the depth. We have the bellwether locations, 35, 10, and 25, 65. What is the bellwether depth that we need to evaluate? There's a question.
I agree, because it's posed right here at the depth of 1 meter, because we sample that with a Kemmer sampler, so 6.2 liter bottle, and we set that to about half a meter below the surface. So we are sampling from right at the surface to about the depth of a meter and capturing that. So when we say that it's a half meter sample, it's actually anywhere from 1/10 of a meter to almost 9/10 of a meter that's actually being sampled right through that. And then the deep samples at 3510 and 2565 are again a half meter off the bottom. So we bring that bottle, set it right to the bottom.
But that's not the bellwether result though for deep, or is it?
Well, so far they're not including the deep yet, because prior to the last few years, we had the brine layer, and that would skew everything at higher salinities. And most of this is for nutrient samples that USGS analyzes. So yeah, I would definitely like it better. That's the other thing, is we have that record going back to 2010 on a pretty much monthly basis. I would say every 6 weeks is a little more accurate due to weather. That's the issue where we are now. And so, yeah, getting a better handle of, do we abandon, not really abandon, but do we modify this 10-year data set that we have to adjust where we're capturing that? And do we do that for the 3 months in the spring, for 3 months of the fall? Do we do that year round? What is the committee's?
Or do we continue with what we're doing?
Or we can continue with what we're doing,
evaluate.
because then we have a data set that goes back.
What about we integrate the sampling results of the different groups? I mean, we're using the same protocol now for determining what the grams per liter is. I mean, you can use ours. We've got 9 sites, 3 different depths.
Right.
We're happy to offer that information, integrate that with.
I think that's something we need more analysis, right? We want to dive into that, and I think in the future protocols we can marry those all together. But for today, it seems to me like maybe sticking with a meter. But if we need to do something to increase the amount of sampling, but continue with your data set, I think it's advantageous to continue.
I think that 1 meter is misguided. Not misguided, but it's misrepresented there. I think if you put that as an approximately half meter, I think that would capture what we're actually doing.
Okay. And does that seem like it suffices for others?
No, I mean, we would suggest go 3 meters.
Because that would give us some
2 sample points, 3 meters,
more.
gives us a more stable salinity. And the brine shrimp population is, distributed throughout the water column. If we just go at the top half meter,
You're gonna be probably more freshwater.
much more fresh water. At least from our data, that's what it shows.
So we're currently, there's USGS, you're not currently measuring at 3 meters at these locations, right?
No, so the samples are shallow and deep, right? And we sample in June and October. But the monthly samples are coming from G-Slip.
And what would it take for you guys to do 3 meter sampling if you want to just add that into the rotation?
An extra 15-20 minutes per site.
Yeah, that is reasonable to ask of you guys.
And we don't need a nutrient
Right, so
sample.
all we
It's
would
just
need
is a bottle.
is a bottle of water.
And only at 2 sites.
And at 2 sites, yeah. At the deep sites where we can get to 3 meters.
Yeah.
We typically pull that same off the bottom, half meter off the bottom at all 4, the 22, 67, 27, 67. We pull that from the bottom also. But a lot of times we're under 2 meters of depth there, even, and especially now we're pushing a meter and a half for those sites.
So do we want to just, I think if you can sample at 3 meters, that can help build that data set. And presume you want to continue your historical record that you've been doing already. So we're adding a 3 meter spot at those 2 sites, sample at those 2 sites. And then I guess in the protocol here, do we want to say at this point, 3 meter samples?
We're departing from our historical data set, though. I'm not saying not to, but you're starting.
The nice thing is we will maintain our historical data set, and so we will have a new representative data set that we can tie back to. Because what it'll be is going forward, we will have the half meter, the shallow, the deep, and a mid. And if we choose to use the mid, that will be an option that we have going forward in the future.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just gonna say, Joe, you might have seen like one of the things that I think Compass Minerals had a comment on was the emergency trigger and how that relates back to HB 513. And we're certainly sensitive to, Compass Minerals trying not to relate this protocol to the, forthcoming legislation and how that would play in. And so I can see why you could be sensitive to like doing 3 meter depths because it might play into that conversation or narrative later. But I think that right now, I think it's worth just mentioning on this, public meeting that the intent here is simply to do this for the protocol. And, all discussions related to, how we manage the emergency trigger under HB 513 will be done so through our rulemaking, and it'll have, chances for public comment. I would imagine this body might have quite a bit to say about it, but I think we should treat these 2 things separately so we're able to differentiate and just get the best data and science, for this protocol.
So I'm not against
Does
getting
that help
data,
though, just
but
to make sure we're differentiating?
the decision-making framework. Sure. Yeah, I hear you. And I'm comfortable with that. But from a decision-making framework, we have decades of data that we're, kind of looking at how past years have responded that have been in this upper paradigm.
That's not true, Joe. We have decades of information at 1 meter, 3 meters, and 5 meters.
Sure, but the regime that relates this lake elevation to the shallow sample from USGS and the deep sample, that's sort of what I'm talking about. I'm not saying they don't have data, but from a decision making.
I think USGS has some data at different depths too, because they integrate it. I mean, they do a salt mass calculation and they base that on a salinity at different depths.
No, it's based on the shallow sample, and then we determine where the deep brine layer interface is. Correct me if I'm wrong, Scott. And it's that shallow sample, that concentration.
Well, there's an upper brine layer and a deep brine layer mass that are differentiated when they need to.
And how do you determine the salinity of the upper brine layer? You do it just with that shallow salinity measurements?
Yeah.
Okay, that's where we're different from you, is where we do it at different.
And I mean, the other thing that strikes me though is 1 meter or 0.5 meters, what I heard described sounds like 0.5 plus or minus 0.4.
I don't know.
right?
that-
So it's
that-
integrated
But it's,
over.
we're taking a
Yeah, I mean,
6.2 liter bottle, that, we're taking a piece
Okay,
of plastic
so-
album that's
right?
about roughly this, and we're
I
sticking
mean-
that in the water centered roughly at it. I mean, of course, the boat's bouncing, but we're trying to be right on about that half meter as we can, and then closing that. And then that's what gets put in the bottles that gets that USGS and not those. So it's,
So the top meter, half meter, everything will continue to be sampled, so we'll still have that data set. But for this regime and this the interim plan protocol, is there any reason we couldn't go off of the 3 meters in your perspective? Or do you?
I mean, is there not a compromise where you continue the sampling that the protocol that's used, collect the 3 meter and begin to establish that data set to kind of go along, and then we can calibrate the two.
Sure.
We're not against data, but it's just.
But we have that data, and it shows much more stability in salinity at 3 meters than at 1 meter.
and UGS has some of that data too. So we have it. If we need it, we can use it.
But in Ryan's presentation of sort of the state of the lake, kind of the lake update, all eyes seem to go to the shallow sample. So I guess that's just where my mind is calibrated. That seems to be the headline.
That's in Ryan's presentations. In our presentations, it's not that way.
So,
I mean, I feel strongly about that because we're really looking for a stable salinity that's most representative of the epilimnion. And I think we have the data that show us that 3 meters is more, if we want to simplify it, that 3 meters is more representative. I'm totally open to taking all the data and integrating it over the epilimnion. Absolutely, if you want to do that. But to simplify things, I think our data is clearly showing that the 3 meters is relatively stable throughout the spring and the fall.
So it seems to me like
to use that.
with only like 5 or 6 minutes left in the schedule time, and hopefully everybody can stick around for a minute to go over, but it seems to me like maybe we should identify other areas where there might be necessary edits, and then maybe we can go back and if we need to hold a vote and decide what that depth looks like, we can try to get some consensus that way. But do you want to hit any of your other pain points?
Can I ask one clarifying question? So in the third box, reduced sperm height after spring runoff has occurred. Okay. By after spring runoff, do we mean December, November? 'Cause that's when we should not like right after spring runoff. Is that can mean a lot of things. So I guess I'm wondering what after spring runoff means. Is that if we don't want to do it right after spring runoff?
Christine made a comment, and I don't know if it's useful now, but if you'd like to hear it, it's in our salt mass calculations, we also compare to UGS salinity concentrations, which does sample at different depths in the water column. Salt mass computations using the 2 data sets are less than 10%, giving us confidence that the shallow samples represent the upper vine layer quite well. Anyhow, that's what she said.
At what time of year, though? We would totally agree, in the fall, but in the spring, we see much more variability.
Sure. So I think so Andrew's got a question on after spring runoff, we'll be evaluating this. I think the intent is that, we would be evaluating raising the berm again in the fall, in the winter. So in terms of lowering the berm, we're not talking about November, December. We're talking about doing it in late summer and evaluating. I guess what the interim protocol is, I think once we see what we have confidence that we've seen a minimum salinity where the water levels max out, the salinities.
The minimum is max.
The minimum max, the minimum salinity. Is that at that
Once
point?
everything's
So-
mixed, so that's the problem.
Yeah, so I mean, the problem I see with that is if you lower the berm late summer, you're like taking off maximum precipitation, daylight precipitation. You'll just turn it, well, you may not, but you're probably just going to turn it off. And so it seems like you'd want to reduce berm height, like maybe the beginning of November, and then raise it back up after you've had your flow, however long you want to do that, then raise it at, early January, early February.
What if we put a time frame in which we did this? Because I think it's going to depend a lot on how much water we need to export and other conditions. And so if we said something like, between September 1st and, October 30th or November 30th, to give us some flexibility, and the Salinity Committee could advise on that. Because I think the one scenario is that, like, depending on how much we have to export, if it's going to take 4 months to do that, like, we can't wait till November. We probably need to do it in like October, or, well, maybe we can, but we need to make those considerations. And
Okay.
so,
Yeah. No, that's fine.
perhaps there's like a
Yeah.
time frame. And I also think there were some sensitivities that we haven't discussed that play into this as well, about, when this, when water gets released and equalizing this to meet some, other beneficial uses.
Okay.
And so I think that maybe that time frame and having the Salinity Committee advise on the timing of that and optimal timing within that range, would that be amenable?
Sure.
I've had this question I've wanted to ask, and I don't really know when the right time to ask it is, but maybe when we're talking about, I like the range idea. I think that's a good time frame idea. In terms of new water that may be coming into the lake, and in terms of reservoirs that might be full and water held back that could be released at a later time, there may be some inputs that are different in the coming years and harder to calculate. And I don't know anything about water and the movement of water. That's certainly not my expertise. So I'm just curious if anybody in the room has any reflections on that, because if there's a timing on that of holding things back, of shepherding water, of moving water at certain times, then that's going to play into salinity and the time frame.
But we already kind of saw that this year, right? Like on
Yeah.
Ryan's graphs, we see that uptick
Yep.
in the last month. That's just, it's abnormal because folks started to realize they needed to make room in the reservoirs.
That's exactly right. Yep.
So I don't know what that looks like either. That's probably a good water resources question. I don't know, Greg, if you can weigh in on that.
Okay, I was sort of following everything. What do you want me to weigh in on?
I think just like what Bonnie was asking is just
Could there be some artificial, like,
hydraulics.
hydraulics inflows or holding back of water that impact the timeline? And do you know anything about that? I have heard some folks talk about how the inflows might be lower because the dams were going to hold back more water, but I don't know what that
I
means.
checked
Yeah.
about 2 weeks ago, and there was, to get them to be full, and not every reservoir needs to be full. I mean, the Bear Lake, they keep it not full for flood control purposes. And also Utah Lake isn't necessarily filled, but it has to reach a certain level during the year in order to deliver water. But if you were to fill every reservoir, it would be 1.9 million acre feet upstream. But that's not totally practical. That was just a quick look, and what I really feel would be filled is something I'd have to look into.
So, yes.
Can I just make a comment on, is that a discussion for another day where we're
Yes.
at our time frame and we're looking at the interim and those things are coming, but they're not in place now?
Yeah, I'm just planting it as
Yeah,
a, as
but
a
I agree,
means
it's a
of,
great
yeah,
conversation, but maybe for the next.
a variable that's uncertain, I guess is what I'm kind of throwing out.
Greg, I had 1.4. If you know, for nameplate, it would be 1.4. So I mean, it's not like what you're saying.
I think, I guess in terms of this protocol, I think, Andrew, to your point, in the first box is that we're going to calculate the salt mass after spring runoff and spillover. So that's really our first stop, is to calculate that and see what we need to do. So I think based on the assumption that we're going to calculate and evaluate what we need to do, I think that should address the timing issue or concern. Because I think there's so many factors there that I think you're right. I mean, precipitation in the North Arm is a factor that needs to be considered, but so is, the time it's going to be required to export water. How much can we even export considering water levels? You know, if we want to capture the maximum amount of winter spring runoff, you know, there's a lot of different factors there that we're going to need to evaluate. And I think
One other point on that too that I just have been trying to wrap my mind on, but in a year that is not like this, where we think we're going to be spilling, we would be capturing that water and having no fresh water in the North Arm, and then give it all that extra time, throughout runoff season to be precipitating. So there'd be that additional time on the front end, and I know that it's harder to like ramp down and then start back up again, so you kind of interrupt that cycle. But there is some front end precipitation that could occur, and like it might be
Temperature, he's gonna target temperature.
and so if we're not having any inflows from May to July like we normally see, those are two really hot months where you might get some good precipitation. So I think there's some things to consider on that side as well. This year it probably would have been screwed anyway if the berm wasn't there. The whole year would have been screwed because you're just pushing water there the whole year.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, basically, I think our timeline is like May to end of October.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sequestering salt.
And given the short term, that we're trying to put on this,
That's okay.
probably not relevant.
It seems like with this runoff year, this whole thing is becoming more irrelevant because we're probably going to get to a point where we just talk.
So I guess what I want to do is, I think we've talked through all the elements of the protocol, and given the time that we're at here, I guess, are there any key concerns here or someone want to make a motion regarding this draft protocol?
I'll make a motion to accept it with the change where it says SAC to decide on the 1 meter. I would like that to be 3 meters, that's my motion, and change the spring salinity to fall salinity for the 120 millimeter. Otherwise, keep the protocol intact.
And just out of, I know your motion has been made, but it might be good to also consider the temporary nature of this protocol and coming up with some data in which we would come back and reanalyze the protocol.
I'll add that to the motion. So,
Could we consider a 1 and 3 meter? Since we're not abandoning a long held data set?
We'd have to decide which one is considered at that point. Then if they're complicated, or it could be I'm wondering if we can make it an average between the 1 and 3. I mean, I'm just throwing out some things that might work for everyone here and trying to figure out where we find our middle ground, but I don't know.
This has nothing to do with the motion, but I think my point is the 3 meter we don't currently collect. So we need to know if we need to actually start collecting that data. And that is going to add time and money to everything that we're doing.
So since we have a long history at 1 meter in that data set that we've been looking at,
but we wouldn't abandon the one.
Use the 1 meter for the purposes of this. Continue with this 1 meter. This is, as you say, temporary, but also identify that 3 meters will be collected as well, and then we can springboard off of that in future.
I made my motion, but how about just leaving it open, taking the 1 meter out and say to be decided? And then we have a protocol, and we just need to get back together and decide on the depth.
That sounds great.
That's fine by
You
me.
want to amend your motion?
I'm trying to see, it's a discussion at this point, but I would amend the motion if that would make everybody comfortable.
I think that would be a step forward from our point, because then we would know to start collecting the 3 meter. We would continue collecting the current surface, and then
I think it would
What's
be.
the amended motion?
Summarize and correct me if I'm wrong, Thomas, but the motion was to accept the draft protocol with a few changes. One is, rather than saying at a depth of 1 meter, would be at a depth be decided by the Salinity Advisory Committee. Number 2 is we would add, below, maintain a salinity between 120 and 160 grams per liter in the fall, and rather than just below 160. And then we would also add that the temporary nature is that this is an interim protocol to be updated by April 30th of 2024.
That's great.
All right, I'll amend the motion to the way you described it. I can repeat it if you want to. That's
No,
time.
Is there,
I don't think we have enough time to read.
is there a second? We need a second.
I'll second it.
All right. Okay, thanks. Is any other discussion on the motion before we vote? All right, hearing none. Guess we could just do a voice vote, unless you'd rather do a roll call.
Whatever you want to do.
So I guess all those in favor of approving that motion would say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, motion is carried, passed unanimously, and so thank you. This is great. So what we'll do, I will take this draft protocol and make those changes, those red lines, and get this back out to you just as an FYI and make sure I got that right. And but then I'll work with Forestry, Fire, and State Lands to do all the reference into the community format that they need and get it back out to you. But the idea is that we use this interim until April 30th, 2024. And I guess I think the important thing is that, you know, we're going to keep evaluating it and keep improving it as we go. So I think lastly, just with some action items is, Kyle, if your division can start sampling at 3 meters, and so we can start building that. Thomas, I think it would be great if we could see a historical record of 135. But I know Christine looked at, and she compared all the data that UGS and USGS had and came up with that relationship that somebody read. Or Craig, you read Christine's comment. So it'd be great if we could see that and we can start looking at that and then I think on the matrix, I think please keep looking at that and considering other data sources. I know I talked to John about, you know, I think there would be a lot of benefit to get the G-slips tag, you know, more formal input on the matrix too. I mean, I know a number of you are on the tag, so we're getting that great input, but I think there's value in just making sure that these other groups are numbers that we're talking about. Anything else?
It's a question. I didn't want to bring this up during the other discussion because it muddies things, but can this group commit to maybe revisiting the 4192 as an elevation? I mean, given some of the issues we have with microbial habitat being so impacted, is that something, I know it's kind of written in stone for now, but is that something we could bring recommendations back to as the year progresses to how it would be?
I think so from my perspective, the surface elevation is probably not appropriate for this body. But the salinity portion of that absolutely is. And I think that it's something that we should probably have more discussions on about how that affects salinity. And then in other aspects, I think the surface elevation, there's some other areas where we could discuss that if that answers that. Okay. But maybe I can also chat after.
Yes, sir. I just didn't know this. Yeah. It looked for, as water levels come back up.
Yeah. Hopefully this year we're all swimming at 4194, right?
Yeah. So I was just going to say clarification too, right? This is a recommendation of the Salinity Advisory Committee to portion of this plan, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that, again, thanks for saying that, Tim, because I think that it is important to recognize too that, this is a recommendation. We do have to have some formal, adoption of the recommendation or acknowledgement of the recommendation. And the fact that it's, interim gives me a lot of confidence that we can now work out some of the hard details that are probably the pain points for everyone in a less stressful circumstance. So I really look forward to the next coming year where we can have better discussions and collect data this summer and see how the bird reacts. So this will be good.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. We have a motion to adjourn. So moved. So moved. Any opposed? All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.